In Russia's early history, it was established as a Tsardom, but through bloody revolution was transformed into the coalition of states known as the Soviet Union, also known as the USSR. This was due to the Tsar known as Nicholas II, who was an incapable leader, which in turn led to his demise. The revolution that caused his downfall was known as the October Revolution, which was led by a man known as Vladimir Lenin. The Bolsheviks party won against the Whites in the Civil War, and then the Bolsheviks transformed into what we call the USSR. In 1994, Vladimir Lenin died of a hemorrhagic stroke. After this, Joseph Stalin became the general secretary or leader of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. He did this by getting rid of his competitors by either bribing them, threatening them, or killing them. Joseph Stalin was ruthless and didn't let anyone stop him from achieving his goal of claiming as much land as he can. He was now in control of the USSR and was on his way to make the USSR one of the most powerful regimes known in history. With all this in mind, the subject today is how the USSR fell and how it broke barriers in the process of doing so.
In World War II, there were two groups: the Axis, which were better known as the Nazis, and the Allies, which were better known as the US, France, and Britain. Russia was a very powerful nation during World War II. They were ruthless and captured as much territory as they possibly could. In the beginning, Soviet Russia agreed to ally with Nazi Germany, and they partitioned and annexed the territories of their European neighbors, Poland, Finland, Romania, and the Baltic states. Though later, Germany and the Axis led a surprise attack on the Soviets, but the Eastern Front trapped the Axis and the German were backed. After this, the Soviets joined the Allies and were now against the Axis. Then in 1942, Germany and the Soviets fought over Stalingrad, now known as Volgograd. About 1.8 to 2 million people died, were injured, or were captured. The Germans pushed their Sixth Army into Stalingrad and seek to achieve their goal of capturing Stalingrad and taking it from the Soviets. The Soviets were being pushed back further and further until they launched their attack named Operation Uranus, which was a two-pronged attack that targeted the weaker Romanians and Hungarians in the Sixth Army and pushed them back. Adolf Hitler gave an order requiring them to stay in Stalingrad and to not leave, though they eventually ran out of food and ammunition, leaving them the only option to surrender. The Russians had about 26 million soldiers that were willing to risk their lives for their motherland. This led to Russia being a very powerful nation that didn't back down from any attacks from the Axis. The war came to an end after the Axis were being invaded heavily by the Allies, leading to Adolf Hitler committing suicide in 1945. The war has now come to an end.
After the Second World War that happened about a year ago, another war that included Russia and the US happened. It was a period of geopolitical tension between the Soviet Union and its allied states and the United States. It was essentially a war that included two big nations and that had the power to wipe out millions of organisms in seconds. In other words, they had nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union had begun to take control of the Eastern Bloc at the moment. The US didn't like the idea of Russia claiming more land. Towards in the late 1950s, Russia and the US were in the process of making intercontinental ballistic missiles. Then in 1962, Russia began to secretly put missiles in Cuba to launch attacks on major US cities. They were on the brink of war until both nations agreed to make an agreement to withdraw missiles. In 1962, the signing of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which banned the use of above-ground nuclear weapon testing, was signed by the US and Russia. Still, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviets were determined to not be humiliated, and they began to build up of strategic forces that the United States was forced to match for the next 25 years. The Cold War began to deteriorate slowly as a new man came to the Soviet Party. His name was Mikhail Gorbachev.
In 1995, a new head of Soviet Party came into the seat of leading the Soviet Union. His name was Mikhail Gorbachev. This gave Russia a sigh of relief and a sign of hope, as he promised a program of reform and fundamental change. Though, before Gorbachev came into office, Russia went through what was known as the era of stagnation. It lasted for 20 years with the rule of Leonid Brezhnev and continued under Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko. This era was when Russia went through many poor economical, political, and social policies. The first thing that Gorbachev did was launch perestroika, or otherwise known as restructuring, which was made to strengthen the USSR's economy because the previous two leaders left the USSR's economy in a difficult place. Gorbachev was dedicated to increased economic growth while increasing capital investment. He wanted their economy to be up to par economically with the West. Later, Gorbachev launched Glasnost, or, in other words, transparency, as a second vital plank of his reform efforts. Glasnost opened the political system, essentially democratizing it. He believed this was the only way to overcome the political and bureaucratic apparatus. As the economic and political situations were deteriorating, Gorbachev wanted to increase his authority, though he didn't implement any decisions and was seen as a constitutional dictator. Though later, Yegor Ligachev came into office and had made it difficult for Gorbachev to use party apparatus to implement any of his views on perestroika. By 1988, Gorbachev reached enough authority to weaken the Central Committee Secretariat and to take the party out of the day-to-day running the economy.
In 1989, a new parliament, known as the Congress of People's Deputies, the new body superseded the Supreme Soviet as the highest organ of state power. The Congress then elected a new Supreme Soviet, which led to Gorbachev being the Soviet president with broad powers. Gorbachev then radically changed the Soviet political life by removing the constitutional article, according to which the only legal political organization was the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, though the defense burden was crippling the country severely. Okay.
This led to Gorbachev cutting expenditures in education, social services, and medical care, which hurt the regime's domestic legitimacy. Also, the huge defense expenditures that they used during the Cold War had also deprived Russia economically. These policies deprived the Soviet Union of ideological enemies, which sequentially weakened the hold of Soviet ideology over people. Later, Russia was still ultimately facing economic problems such as food products. This led Gorbachev to be weakened as a Soviet leader.
At the moment, the Berlin Wall was still up and separating East Germany and West Germany. East Germany was heavily influenced by the communists and was described as the communist state. The wall had some negative effects when it was built, and no one agreed with the wall. The wall separated families, cut off some jobs, and made West Berlin an isolated exclave in a hostile land. Ronald Reagan came to Berlin on June 12, 1987 to deliver one of his most famous speeches that addressed the Berlin Wall.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Ronald Reagan addressed Gorbachev to tear down the Berlin Wall to symbolize an increasing freedom in the Eastern Bloc. This was a non-hostile speech that was directly cited at Gorbachev.
In August 19, 1991, Russia attempted a coup against Gorbachev, which was led by hardline communist elements of the Soviet government and military. The leaders of the coup spent most of their time bickering among themselves and by drinking heavily.
Regardless of their poor efforts to keep the coup going, they managed to put Gorbachev under house arrest and demand that he resign from leadership of the Soviet Union. Boris Yeltsin was seen to be the next leader of Russia, and people hoped for him to come and take Gorbachev out of office. So his stock rose sharply because he publicly denounced the coup and organized strikes and street protests by the Russian people.
Though the people that were leading the coup in the beginning saw that most of the Soviet military did not support their actions, they eventually called off the attempt and it collapsed on August 21st. The collapse of the coup gave Gorbachev a bad look and made him look like a failure. In November 9, 1991, the infamous Berlin Wall fell, and following that was the resignation of Mikhail Gorbachev and the fall of the Soviet Union. The attempted coup against Gorbachev was said to be a factor in the fall of the Soviet Union.
The fall of the greatest regime known in history had a great impact on many people, and thus broke many barriers by allowing people to be more free. These are the following sources that we used in the making of the project.